The ambassador's glass shattered against the marble floor of the Swiss embassy, red wine spreading like blood across the pristine white stone. You, he pointed a shaking finger at Audrey Hepburn, are a communist sympathizer, and I'm going to prove it. September 23rd, 1978. The United States Embassy in Bern, Switzerland. The Cold War was at its peak, and paranoia had infected every corner of international diplomacy. In Washington, politicians saw Soviet spies behind every humanitarian gesture. In Moscow, American agents lurked in every aid organization. And caught in the middle was Audrey Hepburn, who had just made the mistake of suggesting that hungry children didn't have political affiliations. Ambassador Richard Thornwell was a career diplomat who'd built his reputation on aggressive anti-communist rhetoric. A man who saw the Soviet threat everywhere and believed that America's greatest weakness was its bleeding heart liberals who couldn't recognize propaganda when it was spoon-fed to them by pretty actresses with foreign accents. Tonight's reception was supposed to be a celebration. Audrey had just returned from a UNICEF mission to Cambodia, where she'd delivered medical supplies to refugee camps filled with children whose families had been destroyed by the ongoing conflict. The Swiss embassy was hosting a fundraising dinner to support her continued humanitarian work, but Ambassador Thornwell had come with a different agenda. Miss Hepburn, he'd said during his speech to the gathered diplomats and donors, has been traveling extensively behind the Iron Curtain, meeting with officials from communist governments, distributing aid that we have no guarantee reaches the intended recipients. Some might wonder whether her missions serve humanitarian purposes or whether they serve other interests. The room had gone silent. 200 guests, ambassadors, business leaders, philanthropists, staring at Thornwell in shock. This wasn't diplomatic discourse. This was a public accusation of treason against one of the most beloved figures in the world. Audrey had remained seated at the head table, her face composed, but those who knew her could see the fury building behind her elegant facade. Ambassador Thornwell, she'd said quietly, I believe you have something specific you'd like to say. Perhaps you should say it clearly. That's when Thornwell had made his fatal mistake. Instead of backing down, instead of offering diplomatic language that could be interpreted multiple ways, he doubled down. I'm saying that your so-called humanitarian work provides perfect cover for intelligence gathering. I'm saying that your access to refugee camps and government officials makes you an ideal asset for Soviet intelligence operations. I'm saying that naive Americans are donating money to what might be a sophisticated propaganda operation designed to make communism look compassionate. The wine glass had slipped from Audrey's hand then, not from shock or fear, but from the effort of controlling her rage. How dare you, she'd said, standing slowly, her voice cutting through the stunned silence like a blade. The room watched as Audrey Hepburn, still in her elegant black evening gown, walked slowly toward Ambassador Thornwell. Every step was measured, controlled, dangerous. She moved like a woman who'd reached the limits of her patience and was about to demonstrate what that meant. How dare you, she repeated, now standing directly in front of him, suggest that starving children are a threat to American security. How dare you imply that medicine for dying babies is communist propaganda? How dare you stand here in your expensive suit in this luxury embassy and question the motives of people who actually get their hands dirty helping human beings in need? Thornwell tried to maintain his composure, but everyone in the room could see he was beginning to realize he'd miscalculated. Miss Hepburn, I'm not questioning your intentions. I'm questioning your awareness of how your work might be exploited by— Stop, Audrey cut him off. Stop talking. You've said enough, more than enough. She turned to address the entire room, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the embassy ballroom. Ladies and gentlemen, you've just witnessed something remarkable. You've seen an American diplomat publicly suggest that feeding hungry children is an act of treason. You've seen a man who represents the land of the free and the home of the brave argue that compassion for suffering human beings is evidence of communist sympathy. The crowd was transfixed. This wasn't the gentle, graceful Audrey Hepburn they knew from films and publicity photos. This was something else entirely. This was a woman who'd grown up during the Nazi occupation, who'd carried messages for the Dutch resistance, who'd learned that sometimes the greatest evil came from people who wrapped their cruelty in patriotic rhetoric. Ambassador, Thornwell wants to know about my travels behind the Iron Curtain, Audrey continued. Let me tell you about them. I've been to refugee camps where children have swollen bellies and stick-thin arms because they haven't eaten protein in months. I've held babies who weigh less than my handbag because their mothers have no milk and no formula. I've watched 7-year-old children die from diseases that could be cured with antibiotics that cost less than the wine we're drinking tonight. She paused, letting the words sink in. And Ambassador Thornwell thinks these children might be communist agents. The laughter that rippled through the crowd was nervous, uncomfortable. Everyone understood they were witnessing a diplomatic incident that would have consequences far beyond this room. But let's address the ambassador's real concerns, Audrey continued. He's worried about Soviet propaganda. So let me ask you, what propaganda is more effective? The Soviet Union showing the world that they care about suffering children while America questions whether helping those children is treasonous? Or America leading the world in humanitarian aid, demonstrating that democracy and compassion go hand in hand? Thornwell's face was red now, anger and embarrassment warring for dominance. Miss Hepburn, you're twisting my words. I never said— You said exactly what you meant to say, Audrey interrupted. You said it clearly and publicly. And now you're going to live with the consequences. What happened next would be talked about in diplomatic circles for the next 20 years. Audrey walked to the microphone that Thornwell had been using for his speech. She looked out at the crowd of ambassadors, business leaders, and journalists who'd thought they were coming to a simple charity event. I'm going to make some phone calls tonight, she announced calmly. I'm going to call the Secretary of State in Washington. I'm going to call the Director General of the United Nations. I'm going to call the editors of every major newspaper in America and Europe. And I'm going to tell them about Ambassador Thornwell's theory that American humanitarian aid to starving children represents a security threat to the United States. The room erupted. Journalists were already reaching for their phones. Other diplomats were whispering urgently to their aides. Thornwell looked like a man who'd just realized he'd stepped on a landmine. I'm also going to recommend, Audrey continued, her voice cutting through the chaos, that the State Department conduct a full investigation into Ambassador Thornwell's fitness for his position. Because any diplomat who sees enemy agents in starving children, who views compassion as suspicious, who thinks humanitarian aid is a communist plot, is clearly not qualified to represent American values to the world. She set the microphone down and walked back to her table, where she calmly picked up her purse. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your support of UNICEF. The children we serve don't care about our politics. They only care about survival. I hope you'll remember that the next time someone tries to tell you that helping them is unpatriotic. Audrey left the embassy that night with her head held high, followed by a parade of journalists and several ambassadors who wanted to distance themselves from Thornwell's remarks as quickly as possible. The Swiss ambassador who'd hosted the event was overheard telling his wife, "In 30 years of diplomacy, I've never seen anyone destroy a career so elegantly." Within 48 hours, Ambassador Thornwell's comments were front-page news across America and Europe. U.S. diplomat calls UNICEF communist plot. Ambassador attacks Audrey Hepburn's charity work. Thornwell sees Soviet agents in starving children. The reaction was immediate and devastating. The Secretary of State's office received over 10,000 angry letters demanding Thornwell's removal. Editorial boards from the New York Times to the London Guardian published scathing critiques of his remarks. Late-night television hosts made him a punchline. Saturday Night Live did an entire sketch about diplomats who were afraid of Girl Scout cookies because they might contain communist propaganda. But the real damage came from an unexpected source, the CIA. 3 days after the embassy incident, Thornwell received a visit from agency officials who were not pleased that he'd drawn public attention to America's intelligence-gathering methods. The last thing they wanted was global speculation about which humanitarian organizations might be fronts for espionage operations. "You've compromised legitimate operations with your grandstanding," the CIA station chief told him bluntly. "You've made it impossible for us to work with any aid organization without people wondering if they're actually spy networks. You've created exactly the kind of suspicion that makes our job harder." The final blow came from an unexpected direction, the Reagan administration's own foreign policy team. President Reagan had built his political brand on being tough on communism, but he was also smart enough to understand the propaganda value of American humanitarian leadership. When his advisors explained that Thornwell had essentially argued that helping starving children was un-American, Reagan's response was swift and decisive. "Get rid of him," the president reportedly told his Secretary of State. "We can't have diplomats who make us look like we hate children." 2 weeks after the embassy dinner, Ambassador Richard Thornwell was quietly recalled to Washington for consultation. The consultation lasted exactly 1 meeting, during which he was informed that his diplomatic career was over. He was reassigned to a desk job in the Agriculture Department, where he spent the remainder of his government service writing reports about grain exports. He never received another overseas posting. The official State Department statement was diplomatically vague. Ambassador Thornwell has been reassigned to better utilize his expertise in agricultural trade policy. But everyone understood what had really happened. A career diplomat had been destroyed by a woman who'd refused to let him turn hungry children into political pawns. The aftermath of the Thornwell incident had consequences that extended far beyond one man's career. UNICEF experienced its largest surge in donations in the organization's history, as Americans rushed to prove that they did in fact support helping children regardless of their government's political systems. The incident became a turning point in how humanitarian organizations defended themselves against political attacks. More importantly, it established a new precedent in American foreign policy. Future ambassadors understood that questioning the motives of established humanitarian organizations was career suicide. The lesson was clear: attack hungry children at your own peril. Audrey continued her UNICEF work with renewed support from both the State Department and the public. She never spoke publicly about the Thornwell incident again, but privately she told friends that it had been one of the most important confrontations of her life. "I realized that night," she said years later, "that my fame wasn't just about movie roles or red carpet appearances. It was a platform that came with responsibilities. When someone tries to make helping children controversial, you have a duty to speak up, because if I don't defend those children, who will?" The Swiss ambassador, who'd hosted that fateful dinner, kept a framed photo of Audrey from that night in his office for the rest of his career. Not because she was beautiful or famous, but because he'd witnessed something rare. The moment when grace under pressure becomes genuine power. Richard Thornwell spent his remaining years in government writing agricultural reports and watching his former colleagues advance to positions he'd once been destined for. He never understood how a single dinner party comment had destroyed his diplomatic career. But those who were there that night understood perfectly. They'd seen what happened when someone mistook Audrey Hepburn's elegance for weakness, her compassion for naivety, her humanitarian work for political vulnerability. They'd watched as she demonstrated that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who actually gives a damn about doing the right thing. And they'd learned that while you can attack many things in politics, attacking someone's genuine desire to help suffering children is a battle you will not win. Not against Audrey Hepburn, not against anyone with the courage to stand up and say that humanity matters more than politics. The wine stain on the embassy floor was cleaned up the next morning, but the lesson it represented, that some principles are worth fighting for regardless of the consequences, lasted much longer. The end, Richard Thornwell discovered what bullies always discover when they pick the wrong target: that real strength doesn't announce itself with threats and accusations. It announces itself by refusing to let cruelty masquerade as patriotism, and by making sure that anyone who tries to turn compassion into a political weapon lives to regret it.